So welcome everybody to our first plenary session of the conference. It's all about relationships, Indigenous education, and the promise of Indigenization. My name is Ruth Hickey. I'm the Manager of Learning Design and Development with CITL. It is my pleasure today to introduce you to Kellyanne Butler and Ivan J. White. Kellyanne is a member of the Mi'kmaq community through her mom's family in St. George's on the west coast of the island. She is an ethno-historian with a focus on comparative Indigenous studies and a commitment to a direct collaboration with Indigenous communities in her teaching, engagement, and research. Ms. Butler is currently the Indigenous Education Specialist in the Office of Indigenous Affairs and holds an adjunct appointment with the School of Arts and Social Science at Grenfell campus. Ivan J. White hails from the Mi'kmaq community of Flat Bay, where he combines his experience in audio and communications with his dedication to the Mi'kmaq community to tell authentic Indigenous stories that contribute to community pride and progress. Ivan has been a collaborator on a number of research and engagement projects with the Grenfell campus and currently acts as a liaison on a SSHRC-funded collaboration between Grenfell and the Mi'kmaq communities of St. George's and Flat Bay. Ivan will be the moderator for this session, so with no further ado, I will turn things over to him. Over to you, Ivan.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you everyone for joining our presentation. So we're here Kelly's here to talk to you about, it's all about relationships, Indigenous education, and the promise of Indigenization. But I have 5 notes before we start. I'll remind you to stay on mute during the presentation and that we are being recorded. So if you don't want to be part of the recording, you can turn off your video. Please let you know that participants can turn on a live closed captioning, and it works really well. We tested it yesterday. Even with my accent, it worked. It's down in the corner underneath a little robot on the lower left, my left. I don't know if everyone has the same setup as me. And for optimal viewing, the conference is suggesting the layout be stack. So if you go where everyone is being shown, there's a little layout button and you click on stack and you'll get a nice big picture of the speaker, and everyone else will be, minimized up in the corner. And questions will be held at the end of the session. I'll monitor the chat, well, not the Q&A, which you can see on the bottom. And if you want your question asked by me to Kelly, you just leave your whole question in the chat. And if you're really feeling like you should be up on camera, you can put the word question in and we'll schedule you in to ask it yourself. That's it for me. So without further ado, here's Kellyanne Butler.
Thank you, Ivan. Excuse me. And thank you, Ruth. And thanks to all the organizers of this conference. It's really exciting to see how many people have registered for the overall conference. And also just really excited to be asked to give this talk. When I speak, I use a lot of metaphors and stories. So we're going to start off with that. And I'm going to start with, here's the thing about talking about indigenization or talking about Indigenous histories. A lot of times there's this, if we think about it as setting the table, preparing people to be in a particular or collective headspace to be able to have particular types of conversations. And in most situations, that doesn't take a lot of time to set the table. But sometimes when we talk about Indigenous histories or Indigenization, for so many people, it's kind of a new area. And if you can imagine, it's not just setting the table, but the table and chairs are still in the box and the food isn't cooked yet. And so you have to put together the furniture, and then you have to put the chairs under the table, and then you have to set the table. So these first 3 little bits are going to be a little bit of setting the table and trying to get everyone into kind of a similar headspace for this talk. The first thing is the story that was told to me by Chief Misal Joe from Meowpugek, that some people know as Con River. I ran into him one time, I don't know, it was a few years ago, and we were talking about reconciliation, decolonization, indigenization in a university context. And he said to me, and at the time I was feeling a little bit defeated. I don't even remember the context, but I was feeling kind of tired and fatigued over the work. And he said, you have to look at the university. He said, the university is like a car with square wheels. And people who are working on this are the ones behind this car trying to push it down the road. And he said, if you can imagine, you're kind of like rocking back and forth and trying to get your shoulders into it. And eventually all that momentum pushes it forward, and you just hear this big kerplunk, and it goes to the next side of the wheel. And the people who just made that happen are completely fatigued, tired, worn out, but they can't stop because you have to now start rocking it again and rocking it again to try to get it to do kerplunk again. And it made a lot of sense to me. It feels that way sometimes. But he said, as you are doing this, slowly more people are coming to join you, and there gets to be more weight behind that car, and more people are rocking back and forth to get this thing moving. And every single time you hear that kerplunk, little tiny pieces of the corners are chipping away from those tires or wheels, and eventually that car is going to be moving down the road. And it gave me such a feeling of hope, that we are getting somewhere. Things take a long time, but it's still moving. And then he joked at the end and said, well, we'll all be dead by then, because it is a long process. But that's one thing I want you to sort of keep in the back of your mind as we talk about this. The second thing is from an article that just was published. Paula J. in the School of Social Work published it on Indigenous knowledges and critical thinking. And I'm going to quote him. He's talking about an Akan proverb in the context of Indigenous knowledges and critical thinking. And the proverb is, when one hangs at the peak of a cliff, any step backwards is progress. And he explains it, and this is a quote from his article. Akan people understand this proverb to mean that sometimes the most effective way to look for answers in a seemingly unsolvable situation is to pause, step back, and reflect critically on one's actions as well as one's thinking. The politics of indigenizing education require that educators pause, step backwards, and rethink new and varied ways of creating spaces that allow for multiple knowledge systems and offer a more inclusive learning environment. So that's the second thing I want you to keep in the back of your mind. And anything that I reference, any article or work that I reference, I will make available later as a sort of a bibliography or a list. The third thing I want you to think about is the concept of muscle memory. I think everyone is familiar with this term, and sometimes it's used, people think of it only in terms of physical muscles, but it's actually more related to your brain and the way that when you do things cyclically or repeatedly over time, everything becomes more automatic, and your muscle memory just moves. You have these instinctive reactions to very specific situations in life that you're very accustomed to, you're very used to. And so when you go into action, you don't actually have to think about it, you just act. But when we're now faced with something that for the institution is new, the ideas around indigenization and around Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing are not new. But when introduced into an institution that has not been accustomed to this, it is new, and it requires new ways of doing things. And so we have to think of it in terms of, not only do we not have the muscle memory for all of the different things that we talk about, specifically if you look through the whole, like the strategic framework for indigenization, not only do we not have the muscle memory for that, but the muscle memory that we do have is an obstacle for us in terms of achieving the goals of that framework. So keep that in the back of your mind as well. So there's those three things, and they are all related. So now I'm going to move to an analogy, and I'm going to share my screen, if I can do it properly. And I'm going to parallel the structure of indigenization, not the content of indigenization, but the structure and the sort of trajectory. I'm going to parallel it to physical classroom spaces. So what you're looking at here is just a bunch of right-handed desks, and we're all familiar with these. The one in the upper left is like the older version, and then there are newer versions, but they're basically the same type of desk, and they're designed for people who are right-handed. And most people have been in classrooms like this, where you have just rows and rows of same desks. The assumption is that right-handed is the norm, and that's all you need in the classroom. But over time, if you imagine that the earliest period in the classrooms with these desks, there were only right-handed desks. At some point, someone had to say, like, I'm left-handed and this is very uncomfortable, I physically can't take notes, or they went to a counselor. Somehow people got involved and said, we have to make accommodations for people who are left-handed. And then you have the masterful engineering of a left-handed desk. And these are introduced then into classrooms. This is, the 60s and the 70s. And you see these classrooms full of desks. And then you see the circled ones are the left-handed desks. So you still have a room full of right-handed desks, and you're just adding in what you think is an appropriate number of left-handed desks to accommodate the people who don't fit the norm. And I'm not left-handed, but anyone who is left-handed, and I've heard people talk about this, it can be incredibly frustrating because you have to then find the left-handed desk and you only can sit in that spot. You don't get to choose where you sit, etc. Then we came to where people acknowledged that someone who uses a mobility device also cannot use the right-handed desks, but they also can't use the left-handed desks. So then we have the introduction of a table that ends up getting put in usually the front corner of a classroom with a big sticker on it to indicate that only people who are using mobility devices are supposed to use those tables. So we have a classroom like this, and you've got left-handed accessible on the left side, and up in the far right corner of the classroom, you have the wheelchair desk, right? In these shaded areas. But what this demonstrates, or what this represents, is there is still this clinging to the belief that the vast majority of people are comfortable in these right-handed desks. It has identified people that they want to accommodate, or situations that they want to accommodate, but it continues to presume that that mainstream norm is adequate for everyone else, which is the bulk of people. But what about someone who sprained their ankle and is on crutches one day? What about obese people? What about all kinds of other types of mobility issues that might not have you in a wheelchair per se, but also make it incredibly difficult for you to sit in that desk? So we are now at the point where we've figured that out in terms of physical classroom design. Now, certainly there are still classrooms that look like the ones with all the right-handed desks, but as places get remodeled, and people who are very involved in universal design for education and whatnot are people who are leading this, but you end up with figuring out, like, we can make changes, we can change things to the point where we aren't accommodating anyone. We're just creating something as a foundation that everybody can use and everyone can be comfortable with. And so you can then set up your room any way you want to set it up. So if you're giving a pure lecture that requires note taking only, you can set it up a particular way. You can move it around so that people can talk to each other and so on. Think about that in parallel with making these big changes at the university in terms of indigenization. The goal is that we are no longer putting little tiny fixes in corners of rooms and on the periphery to accommodate specific groups of people. The goal is that we end up with something that resembles, in a more figurative sense, resembles that universal classroom where you can move around the desks and everyone is comfortable. And so I'm going to take you through sort of like a quick history of indigenization efforts at universities over time. So in terms of university efforts at addressing Indigenous student needs, this is how it all began. So in universities, people have been going to universities over time, and at some point, somebody started collecting data. This would be in the mid 20th century, collecting data on, for example, completion rates, and finding that Indigenous students in university situations were not having the same completion rates as their counterparts who were not Indigenous. And this led to the first efforts, and I call this the long model because this has been for decades, probably like 30 years for some institutions, where it's recognized that something needs to happen in order to help students succeed at university in terms of Indigenous student supports. So supports are put in place, and it could be any one of these 4 types of supports, and in some places all 4 of them, including Indigenous staff, sometimes special tutoring opportunities for Indigenous students, Indigenous programming, which might be cultural programming and ways of making students feel more at home on a campus. And sometimes it means dedication of space for Indigenous students. And this has been going on for a very long time at many universities. But it's a deficit-based model. It presumes that the Indigenous students are the ones who need to change in order to be successful at a university. And this is parallel to the left-handed desks. This is saying, we're going to offer you some sort of an accommodation to help you fit in to our existing structure. More recently, and this is where many universities sit right now, there's this recognition that it's not just about Indigenous students and supporting Indigenous students. That is a big piece of it. But we actually, and this has all come about after the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and the calls to action, the 94 calls to action, is this acknowledgement that, and certainly the statement from Justice Murray Sinclair when he said, it's education that got us into this and it's education that's going to get us out. This is where we start talking about different ways of acknowledging the deficits in the institution and making changes to the institution to make the university, it's not just about the Indigenous student success, that's very important, but it's also about the qualities of graduates that you are having leave your institution after they have done their work at the university. So this is basically where most places are now who have already undertaken this. And the size of these circles is the relative investment, like the resources and human resources that are dedicated to these things. And where I say campus change here, I'm talking about things like aesthetic changes, greater community engagement, specific types of programming like elders on campus. But the Indigenous student supports are still important, and they're still, today, they're still like the biggest biggest dedication that universities are making. And then you see this structural change example. This is a very small circle, and this is like a tiny group of people off in the corner talking about structural change, indigenization and decolonization. And this is what is coming through in a lot of the strategic framework for indigenization, is the recommendations and the actions that will help make those structural changes. And where you see the circle overlapping on the bottom here is where, when these pieces start to work together, there's a synergy that is created through the efforts from multiple fronts. And this is where I see most places today. What we're looking for is for all of these things to come together. And so we are now just embarking on this new strategic framework for indigenization. And it's a 5-year framework that will then be reevaluated and reviewed, and hopefully renewed. But this is where we want to take it. So what we want to see is for an equal amount of effort to be going into all these areas. And so what we need is a big push in the structural change, which is what that framework is going to help us with. And in the very center, this is the sweet spot, right? This is where all 3 of these areas are coming together, and there's a synergy in that helps to move us forward in terms of indigenization and decolonization. And this is strength-based thinking. It's talking about Indigenous students as a valued part of the institution that actually improve the institution, and Indigenous peoples in general who improve the institution. And this is where you move toward those universal classroom designs, where you have all of these tables with wheels and chairs with wheels, and more people actually feel comfortable and have the best chance of success. As you move forward, then that sweet spot, it gets bigger and bigger until eventually, this is, I would say, decades in the future, you have this accessible institution where you don't have to put extra supports in one area and extra money into a certain other area, because all of these things have come together, and the basic framework and the basic fabric of the university is welcoming, is reflective of all the populations, that we have Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing as part of the fabric of the pedagogy, of the engagement, of the research, of the university in general. Okay. So what does all that mean? A lot of it is obviously it's allegorical and metaphors and whatnot, but it's really kind of important to get our heads wrapped around this before we can move forward. Because what happens is, first of all, everyone is super eager. Not everyone, but there are many people that are really, really eager for things to move forward. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of things specifically from the framework for indigenization, to kind of emphasize sometimes where there's a misunderstanding, or there are multiple understandings of what we're doing. In the framework introduction, it talks about, I'm quoting pieces here, it says, it's incumbent on the university to make space, both literally and figuratively, to Indigenous peoples and their knowledges, pedagogies, perspectives, and more within the academy. So what this means is, it's not just talking about having bigger numbers of Indigenous people. And it's not just talking about having more courses that include more Indigenous content. It's the how and the way that it's done. So if we're talking about the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the academy, how are we including them? It's more than including bodies, it's including the knowledges that Indigenous peoples bring, and the perspectives that Indigenous peoples with lived experience bring to the university. And so that means, just as an example, sometimes people think, well, there isn't much in my area that I can change in terms of content. I don't know how to incorporate Indigenous content in a specific topic. And that does take a lot of work, right? Like figuring out, especially if you've gone through your entire education and no one has exposed you to anything related to, let's say in hard sciences, people sometimes think that there's no correlation between hard sciences and Indigenous ways of knowing, being, doing. There absolutely is, but it wouldn't have been part of mainstream training. But there's also the pedagogy of it. So how are you teaching and how are you undertaking your courses? There's content and there's also pedagogy. So in the framework, it says indigenization involves two critical pillars. And this is what I'm just talking about. So there's this embodied representation, but there's also the knowledges, values, worldviews, histories, and cultures that are woven through pedagogy, instruction, curriculum, and research. And speaking specifically about the strategic priority number 2 in the framework, which is focused on teaching and learning, the framework says it begins with a learning environment that includes a greater number of Indigenous scholars and Indigenous curriculum specialists who can support each other and foster growth across all programs. So it's talking about a beginning. And it's talking about having Indigenous scholars and their ways of knowing added to the academy. And so that's where we are right now. Here we are, we're in the middle of a cluster hire process that's going to bring some Indigenous scholars into the institution. And that isn't the only time that should happen, right? So this is something that is a goal that would be ongoing, is to continue to look for Indigenous scholars who can come and participate in the university. Now, people who are not Indigenous might be thinking like, well, how does this affect me and what can I do and what are things that I can do in my work to help with indigenization? And what I'd like to say to that is, number one, listen to your Indigenous colleagues, and if they recommend readings to you or articles to you, take them up on that and do that reading. I've heard people say sometimes, well, we can't be putting everything on Indigenous people because they're overburdened already. And so then sometimes people want to take off on their own and pursue new types of actions. And that's great for people to have ideas on how to move forward. But also remember that indigenization is led by Indigenous people. Like it requires Indigenous people with lived experience. Otherwise, it's not indigenization. In best case scenario, it can definitely be reconciliation, and it can be decolonization, but it could also, without the proper context, could be received as colonialism. So it's important to be careful about moving forward without guidance. There's a lot in the framework that offers advice on steps to be taken, like talking about new ways of content delivery. So new ways of program delivery, including delivery in community, having blended delivery options, online delivery. So there's a component to this that is about accessibility. There's a component that's about content, but accessibility and content aren't effective if you don't have those Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing as part of that process. So before we go to questions, I'm going to offer just some cautions about enthusiasm and speed, and then give some suggestions for things that people might want to do over the summer in preparation of the fall term 2021. So returning to those 3 pieces that I talked about at the very beginning, the story about the car with square wheels, that is a story that clearly takes a long time, right? In order to get those corners of those wheels crumbled away to the point where they become round and they sail down the road, that is a long, long process. That's not going to happen in the 5 years of this framework. that's something that's going to take a very long time. And if it took us hundreds of years to get to the point where we decided to turn the boat around, it's going to take us a long time to make those changes. And so I think that there's an impetus to think that, especially people that are very eager to help and interested in moving forward, there's this impetus to want to do everything right away. And it is, I think, encouraged by some of the, for example, funding agencies that over the past probably 3 or 4 years have heavily increased the amount of funding that is available if you add an Indigenous component. And I think that puts pressure on people to think that they have to figure out a way to add an Indigenous component in order to get funding. And maybe that could have been communicated better by the funding agencies, but they also meant well. So a lot of things are people meaning very well, but sometimes perhaps rushing a little bit too much because it's how you do it. It's not just what you do. So thinking about that car with square wheels, that's an important thing to remember. It took a really long time, or will take a long time, for those corners to break away. And if we return to the story about when you're hanging at the peak of a cliff, any step backwards is progress, and the advice that educators pause, step backwards, and rethink, and then think about the muscle memory analogy and how we have to, all of us have to recognize that we're programmed to do things in a very particular kind of way. And in order to change that and to kind of remove some of those instinctive actions that we have to consciously think about that as we move forward. And we're trying to create new muscle memory so that, you know, in 5 years from now, maybe there is a little bit of that, but that's also something that's years and years in the making. So with that, what can you do? Like, what can you do right now? And what I'm going to tell you is going to be disappointing to a whole bunch of people, because people want to have a really big thing that they can do and to feel, I think, a sense of accomplishment of something that's larger than what I'm about to suggest. So between now and the fall, there's two things that I would say to anyone who's interested in moving forward with indigenization or helping with indigenization. In terms of helping to change your muscle memory and changing your perspectives, not everybody's on Twitter, but a lot of people are on Twitter. And this, I suggested this to someone before, and they said this was very superficial, but it is not. Anytime that you go on social media and you're scrolling through, you are being bombarded with information. And whatever you have chosen to follow is scrolling past your face every time that you look on Twitter. Part of the way that you can help yourself to educate yourself and to help kind of move your headspace is to start following native Twitter. This is a list of, it's just a beginning list of, I would just challenge everyone to add these particular Twitter handles to their list of people that they're following, so that when you're scrolling through, whether it's in your morning routine, in your evening routine, you're going to see things that are different than what you have been seeing in the past. Some of you may already be following all these people, and probably very likely if you came to this session, you are aware of who these people are. But you're going to see things differently because this is going to be some of the subliminal messaging that is going to be put into your brain on a daily basis. And some of the things that they might be talking about might be puzzling to you. Like, why is this a big deal? Well, that'll start stewing, and you can start thinking about that. And you might start responding to some of the people that are posting or tweeting various pieces of information. You might be surprised at the reactions that some of these people have to events that you've seen on mainstream news outlets and wasn't presented in the same kind of way. So this is one of the ways that you change, it's kind of like changing your environment a little bit. That's one thing. The second thing is preparing courses for the fall. This is, to many people, this is going to seem like such a tiny, tiny thing, but this is what is the crumbling of the corners of the wheels. If you try to take on too much, you're going to end up just like trying to tread water to keep your mouth above the level. These are the things I would suggest people do. Look at the syllabi that you have from your various courses. First, find and review scholarship from Indigenous people in your field. And that's something you can search for and find. And then incorporate some of that scholarship into your syllabus. Look at your syllabus and for any one of your courses and ask yourself, do I have any Indigenous authors on the readings list? Are there any Indigenous people represented here? It doesn't matter what the topic of your course is. It doesn't have to be an Indigenous topic. Every field, every discipline has Indigenous people in it. So find that scholarship, challenge yourself to incorporate one really good Indigenous reading into your syllabus. And then you yourself make sure that you know it really well. And if you want to discuss it with someone else, talk to an Indigenous friend or colleague and discuss the article with them. You might even, within your unit, if a unit decides to do something like this, you could start a reading group of Indigenous scholarship and challenge each other to add it to your syllabus. So go through your syllabus and ask yourself if there's anything in your syllabus that challenges dominant narratives. And if there's nothing there, just ask yourself why that is. So these are the things that I suggest for people. And I'm happy to take questions or comments. And I'll leave it to Ivan to tell me who's got questions.
Sure. Thank you, Kelly. That was great. I noted when you were doing the wheel analogy that people always said we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we can certainly refine the one that we're given.
That's right.
So if everyone's shy, I do have a question. Do you know of or do you see any like great contemporary examples of those three prior framework priorities overlapping? Like it's so close that like
I hate to call out any institution
I know.
because even the ones that if you asked me 3 years ago to do that, to name who are way ahead of the game, I would have said the University of Saskatchewan. And I'm not saying that that it's not true now, but here is part of that. This is like, if you can imagine a speed bump that's like 10 years long, that's kind of like where this is, right? There's going to be a lot of trying to do something and then something happening. You got to reposition yourself just to get over that hump. So the University of Saskatchewan has been a leader for decades. But very recently, and one of the programs that they started, which was about 3 or 4 years ago, was they determined that they wanted the faculty complement. This was within the College of Arts and Social Science or Arts and Sciences. They wanted the faculty complement to match what the population of the province was. And they determined that that meant that within the College of Arts and Sciences, they had to hire 32 more Indigenous faculty. They already had a significant number of Indigenous faculty, but they needed 32 more in order for the faculty percentage of Indigenous faculty members in that college to match up with the population of the province in terms of Indigenous population. And they decided that would be a 10-year process, and they would do a cluster hire every year. And their goal was at the end of 10 years, they'd have those 32 people. And this was fantastic. But what happened, I think last year, I think 9 Indigenous faculty resigned amidst a lot of just concerns and allegations around racism and hostility and inability to move forward. So nothing's perfect. And I would imagine that we're going to experience, hopefully not something like that, but things are going to happen. Things are going to happen that are not awesome. And we just have to pick ourselves up together and keep on going. And I think one of the things that can prevent something bad like that happening is being really honest in our internal conversations with one another. and understanding that it's uncomfortable, that the change is uncomfortable for people. It's hard. Yeah, so I don't, that would be one of the places I would say was doing really well. And I'm not, I was at that university for 7 years, but I'm not there now. And so I don't really know the context around what happened with that. But I think they still have really good programs in place, and hopefully they'll bounce back.
Thank you, Kelly. So just to clarify, because there was a question and it was answered, people, if you want to direct your questions to the Q&A, I will read them. If you want to come on stream, raise your hand. So we have a question in the Q&A that showed up just before the raised hand, and now the raised hand is gone, but that's okay. From Lords Pena Castillo. I hope I didn't butcher your name. What about science disciplines such as computer science? It is hard to know who is an Indigenous scholar and what would be an Indigenous perspective in computer science.
So whatever your field is, this is where you just start doing your own research, right? I mean, if you Google any field and put Indigenous scholars after it, things are going to pop up. You're going to find, you can also join particular organizations where you might be more likely to meet these people. And for example, the Native American Indigenous Studies Association, NASA, people presume that it's only about like Indigenous histories, Indigenous cultures and content like that, but there's actually there are panels that are done every year that it's like Indigenous engineering, Indigenous chemistry, and that sort of thing. So that's research that you would do, and it's all out there. It just depends on how much you want to do the searching for it.
Perfect. Shannon, do you have a question? You can light yourself up with audio
Hello,
and
Kelly.
video or both.
How are you? How's everybody?
Hi.
Thanks very much for your words. I don't have a question so much as a comment. I hate to say it, but one of the things that I notice is that there doesn't seem to be right now a mechanism for honoring, for recognizing, and for reimbursing Indigenous knowledge holders, and indeed any knowledge holders within community. And I think that's something that MUN needs to put in place. It's not fair of me to ask someone, an elder, or indeed anyone from the community who holds that knowledge, to come into the class, and I have nothing to give them besides my thanks. And it's not appropriate. So that is one thing that I think we can do as an institution to, drive this forward, to introduce different forms of knowledge and different ways of knowing, and you know the rest. So I think that's something we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you. That's actually in the framework. So that is happening. I mean, it's not happening right away, but it's in the framework for that to be evaluated. And you're absolutely right. It's I'm actually in the middle of something right now where I connected people to a classroom, and they did get an honorarium, but then they were asked to do a whole bunch of other stuff that I didn't know was going to happen. And so there's this conversation around, for example, if you're in a class and you ask someone from, I don't know, government to come in for some reason and give a talk in your classroom, the person that they send is employed and salaried, right? They're sending someone as part of their 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 day, and they go into the classroom and give that talk or whatever, but they're paid a salary through that employer. When you ask Indigenous knowledge holders to participate in anything, whether it's in a classroom or it's with a unit or to give a talk at some sort of an event, they're not coming as representative of an employer where they're being salaried. So you're absolutely right, but that is in the framework.
Oh yeah, I'm just saying it's important. So we got to get it done.
Yeah, and so that I just want to say in terms of got to get it done. We had sat down, those of us that worked on the framework, and I hope Catherine doesn't mind me sharing this little anecdote, but we sat down and talked about, like, we have this 5-year framework and we have to implement it, right? And so we sat down and each of us was putting in what's the most important thing in year 1 and what's the most important thing in year 2. And when we came together with our lists, it was kind of funny because, of course, we had almost everything was like most important right now. We cannot do everything right now. That's that chipping away of those square wheels. That's the muscle memory. that's the Akan proverb. Everything isn't going to happen right now. Like it's going to get staggered over time. And I think we're doing a pretty good job of prioritizing how to tackle those things. But one of the first basic things that has to happen is more Indigenous people employed by the university in order to do all this work. And I don't mean to imply that it's all Indigenous people doing the work, but we need more.
Next, we're going to go to Tom. I see your hand raised.
Thanks, Ivan. Hi, Kelly. Tom Cooper from the Faculty of Business Administration. Great talk. Lots of things for me to think about, especially in terms of developing coursework and syllabus. Great points. Kelly, in the past, we've had like MBA students go into Indigenous communities at their request to work on projects or work on initiatives, like business planning, relatively kind of straightforward things. With a new framework and moreover, in terms of more understanding about indigenization, do you have any ideas of good practices for kind of student experiential learning that's led by Indigenous communities to make sure that they're aware of the issues, et cetera, before they go in? Thank you so much. Great presentation once again.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question, because you're right. And there are oftentimes situations where communities are asking for sometimes the university is asking Indigenous people for something, but sometimes Indigenous communities are asking. I mean, there's a reciprocal relationship, right? Over the next couple of years, you're going to see some modules and workshops that are put together that are designed for this sort of thing, like to have like some basic understandings of protocols and diversity of Indigenous groups, as well. As I'm sure you know from working with Indigenous groups that everything is contextual. So what you might do with a group on the south coast of the island might be different from something that you would do with a group if you went into Labrador or the west coast or the northern peninsula. And so you'll see over the next year or two several different professional development types of opportunities, but certainly for students and staff and faculty, which would help with that.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Another question in the Q&A. Often folks teach what they know, in quotes, so it may be daunting to include Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing in their teaching for non-Indigenous folk who may be well-intentioned and do not want to misinterpret or misunderstand the foundation that Indigenous scholars are sharing. Are there any other tips aside from reaching out to Indigenous friends and colleagues for guidance to ensure that well-intentioned readings or assignments go over well?
That's a really good question. And I think that that's one of those double-edged sword types of situations, because sometimes people are very worried that they don't want to do a misstep or cause harm where they're intending to do something good. And all I can say to that is the step back and reflect stance is always, I think, the best way to proceed. So it might not be the right time for some people to do that. But I think if you find the reading, like I suggested, if you find one reading, maybe what you want to do is talk to an Indigenous colleague and not overburden them, but talk to them about that reading. Maybe there's something in it that that they can help you understand if you've read it and you're not getting it, or there's some reason you don't feel comfortable presenting that to students. And the other thing is that you can also incorporate readings from Indigenous scholars and also then seek some funding from your unit in order to bring in somebody to help you with that class discussion or whatever it may be. And I know that it's not easy to go and find funding from your unit, but I also know that some units have done that. It depends on the argument that you make and how often the unit head is being asked for that.
No more questions in the Q&A. Anyone wanted to ask in person? Shy.
Don't be shy.
Shy at all. We literally can't bite.
Ivan, hi, it's Tom Cooper. I have another question, if that's okay. Um, the Kelly and and Catherine, whomever would like to answer this. Well, Kelly, you're the presenter, with Catherine sitting right in front of me on the call. If in 10 years from now, is there a vision of success that we could see? That I know, like you said, this is a speed bump of 10 years, and I'm just really intrigued in terms of what, if we're aiming for something and we're working for 10 years, and I love the ideas that you gave us, but is there a vision of success that we can think about in terms of the indigenization? Obviously more faculty members who identify as Indigenous, but beyond that, is there anything tangible that we can see from a vision standpoint?
So first, I didn't mean to imply that we would see success in 10 years, but I see
Oh no,
this
I
as,
made that's my number.
okay,
Yeah, that could
okay.
be 25 years.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
So like I see this as 50 or 100 years. And so and that's where people kind of like go, oh geez, she's crazy. What is she talking about? But I think that the only way, and here is kind of like, this is sort of the a disconnect between sometimes with Indigenous ways of knowing, being, doing, and then institutions that are driven by metrics, for example, because there is a need to try to, you do need to figure out a way that you're going to measure something, right? But when we put the timeline guideposts out first as the determiner and not the overall change that's happening, then we are trying to, it's kind of like we're trying to meet a guidepost, and so we can end up rushing and doing things in a more superficial manner than doing them in a good way. And I would say that what's going to happen is that, and I'll give Catherine a moment to speak too, but what's going to happen in 5 years is we're going to look back on this time, and say, what happened? Like we have to say what has happened, and take an inventory of what we see as good things that have happened. And this would probably involve the same type of, or a similar type of consultation process that happened, getting to this point with the framework in the first place is what are faculty saying happened? What are students saying happened? What are community members saying happened? What kind of research are we seeing that might look a little bit different from what we saw in the past? I would say that we won't be able to set up expectations until we see what happens in the first 5 years, and then be able to say, okay, look at how much we did. Maybe it's more than we thought was going to happen, and maybe it's less than we thought was going to happen. I know that we've had conversations just recently, with the framework having passed, and when we look back and realize that this kind of started like 4 years ago, not with the actual consultations, but the conversations around it. And all along the way, it's kind of sometimes hard to see the progress that you're making because you're still in the weeds. But when you get to this point, we have this beautiful document, and we can be proud of it. And then you can look back and say, look how much we accomplished. But during that time, it was very hard to see. And I think very hard for the university community to know where it was. And so I would like to just, if Catherine wants to say something, to please jump in.
Thanks, Kellyanne. I thought you answered that. I have nothing further to add. I agree with what you said. But I do think we will see success. In 10 years down the road, we will see progress from where we are today, without a doubt. But exactly what that looks like, we are in the process now of hiring 5 tenure track Indigenous faculty members. Let's make sure that those 5 Indigenous faculty members are, we create an environment for success for them. And that's something that we can all do. And I think if 10 years down the road, we still have those 5 Indigenous faculty members and more besides, I think that will be, big success.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I think we can finish up with the question that's sitting there from Valerie. The Gardner Center often works with Indigenous clients to support professional development for teams or for individuals within Indigenous organizations. We would like to include case studies and experiential learning and that directly relates to this audience. Is the university developing resources in support of such learning that will be available to non-academic and academic units? Now we got 4 minutes to answer that.
So those types of specific questions, I think, are more for like side conversations, but the answer is yes. In terms of providing assistance in, like, this is about capacity building at this point. So the model up until recently was, in terms of like indigenizing, a lot of times it involved people from in the Office of Indigenous Affairs or the Indigenous Student Resource Center doing, you know, like a guest lecture in a classroom, maybe once a semester or something like that, or coming to talk to a unit at a department meeting or something like that. This framework is signifying like a shift from that, right? So now we're at the point where we're not putting band-aids on things. We're trying to develop a wellness of professional development, so that if we can package some of these modules and workshops for people, that this is going to provide units with avenues through which they can build their own capacity and be able to participate in indigenization, reconciliation, and decolonization in fulsome ways, so that they can start weaving it throughout like an entire course and not just have it on one day. Even though those efforts are important, and it does have a positive effect on students, all students, whether they're Indigenous or not Indigenous, that's a step in the process, and we're now going to move beyond that step. So just the general answer to your question is, yes, there's going to be supports available, but something really specific like that would, I don't know that I'd want to answer it on the fly with 2 minutes left in the session.
And there's another question. Do you have thoughts specific to the role of non-academic and administrative staff in the way forward for indigenizing education?
Yes, there's a role for everyone in this. And so part of that is supporting your Indigenous colleagues. And another thing is, for example, a lot of times there's something that people want to do on campus or at one of the campuses around indigenization or around Indigenous topics. And they can't find Indigenous people that are available, right? Like they've contacted and someone is busy and they can't go. And sometimes then there's this plan to move forward without Indigenous people because they can't find Indigenous people who have time at that time. To me, I would say that the answer isn't move forward without Indigenous people. The answer is go to your unit heads and ask them what they're doing to try and attract Indigenous people. So it's not just about a cluster hire. It involves staff and faculty, but it also is, in general, how are job ads worded? Are they attracting a diverse set of applicants, not even just related to Indigenous people, but diverse in general? What are those units doing to allow you to have more Indigenous colleagues? And so that's one of the things that non-Indigenous staff and faculty can help. But certainly there are all kinds of, like this session right now is an opportunity to participate. And there have been a variety of different sessions, week-long celebrations, guest lecturers that have come to St. John's campus, have come to Grenfell campus, have been at the Labrador Institute, and those are always opportunities to participate.
Excellent. Thank you, Kelly. And I believe I now hand it back to you, Ruth. Thank you for having us. It's great.
I'm going to test my experience here, and I'm going to say, well, Leok, and thank you to Kelly and Ivan for sharing this information with us. My takeaway from your presentation is certainly to pause, step back, and think versus to jump in and react. And I also understand that I have a lot of work to do on my own muscle memory, and I'm going to do that by changing my environment with some of the suggestions you made. I know there'll be many more conversations and learning opportunities around indigenization at Memorial as we aim to achieve the goals of your strategic plan for indigenization. I want to thank everybody for participating in this session. It was great to see the numbers that are here. There will be a recording made available on the conference website very soon after the conference. And I want to thank everybody for being here again, and enjoy the rest of the sessions that we have available for you. Thanks so much.